and I had just worked with Matt and Trey to pitch South Park to Comedy Central. You can start up the studio to build South Park and build that farting Canadian, peanut head stuff is cute, but George Lucas just called me to go work on the Star Wars re-releases. So George Lucas looks at me and says, "Can you add a cloud car in this shot between frames 67 and 92?" And I say, "Yeah, sure." And he leaves the room. Producer says, "Are you out of your mind? It's going to film out in 3 days."
Terrence Masson, or Masson, Tman, as they call you at ILM.
They don't need the French accent. It's just so I tell my mom says it's like you go to mass on Sundays.
The man, the myth, the legend.
That's right. That's you.
Indeed. I do appreciate you making time for us here on A Cup of Joe. This is the Life After VFX series. So it's where we talk about how folks should enter into VFX when they're inspired to do so. And then once they're in, they can go someplace else. Yeah, that you're not committed to just staying to one part of the career. But what I like about my career and your career is you can still be in VFX, but not in the studio life. And I think that you're a great representation of that, where you're still in visual effects, so to speak, but you're not bound by the 90-hour a week studio lifestyle that we both maybe stepped away from. So I appreciate you making time for us today.
Hey, it's great to be here. I love talking about this and the old days, which seem to be, like last month or last year. And it's, when you start saying, holy crap, it's been, 35 years or something.
It was 1989 is when you first started 3D animation. As at least what it looked like to me. Is that reasonable? That's a pretty early part of the game. 3D animation was, I think, unheard of outside of maybe Last Starfighter back then.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. First kind of got paid for it, like flying logos back in the day, right? Because before that, it was just I was doing my MFA using a Commodore Amiga with D-Paint 3 and color cycling with Sculpt 3D and all that stuff. But that was in college and freelancing stuff. But my first paying staff job doing 3D with like Alias version 2 was at Target in Boston.
And I was surprised by this. I thought you started at ILM around the same time as me, but turns out you actually first worked at ILM back in 91. I was trying to correlate it with what movies were coming out. Was that Hook that you worked on back then, or what was the first movies you worked on at ILM?
Yeah, so it was humble beginnings too, as a technical assistant, but quickly became a digital artist doing all 2D effects animation stuff. Yeah, it was actually, I got in just after T2 wrapped, and I offloaded, I backed up, I did all the backup of the T2 stuff off the digital disc recorder, the DDR, to make room for Hook, which was the big one. That was my first big show. And there were a bunch of ones that they had come in at about the same time. Death Becomes Her was in house. We started pre-production on the original Jurassic Park. So we did original, early R&D on the original Jurassic Park.
Gotcha. So this is was this before Spaz's big breakthrough, or was this around that same time as the
right around that same time? That would have been late 91. Yeah. Down in the pit, and seeing the early CG dinosaurs on Softimage and all that.
Yeah, and for those who don't know what I'm talking about, I'll put a link to Spaz's new documentary, who was one of the key artists in getting the Jurassic Park digitally in front of Steven Spielberg and moving him away from claymation, basically, and stop motion. Golden age of ILM at that time. I mean, it's considered by some of the folks like a time at ILM that could never be recreated, right?
No, you're absolutely right. There will never be, because the whole CG department was like 50 people. We would be like, with Spaz and all the others say, let's go on a canoe trip on the Russian River, and it was like everybody would show up on the weekend in canoes. The whole department. But my oldest daughter had just been born. It was, do I move the family out or do I go back? And it was just, I went back east because a mentor of mine, Doug Trumbull, was starting up a project in the Berkshires, not far from my home. So I was like, oh shoot, I can always go back to ILM, but how often do you get an invitation to work with Doug Trumbull?
I mean, he did 2001.
Started when he was about 23 years old, did a lot of effects work for Stanley Kubrick on 2001 Space Odyssey, including the famous Stargate sequence at the end. But he went on to design all the visual effects for Blade Runner, Star Trek the Motion Picture, pulled that one out of the 911 call. So much work, amazing stuff. So he hired me to be his, I had the unique title of image engineering supervisor.
Yeah, Doug Trumbull's legacy throughout his whole career and really up until the end here was always about offering the studios and the folks making visual effects or rides technology that was absolutely the next generation, and it was done through frame rates and other image manipulation techniques, but he was always on that cutting edge. So I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know how much they've experienced his work and experienced his legacy. And even Dennis Muren, it was, I think, at one point working for him or under him on 2001 and other things. So I mean, the folks that saw him as a mentor are now the industry's mentors, like yourself.
It's true.
Eventually you did some time at Digital Domain, right? I mean, like I was joking with you before we started, everyone should do some period of time. You got to go work at Digital Domain.
Some version. It
seems to be an industry rule, or if not and so you came into Digital Domain. What was that you worked on there?
Our group, which was led by VFX supervisor Joel Hynek, at the Trumbull shop. Joel said, "Hey, they're starting up this company in LA with your old boss Scott Ross. I was thinking of going there, but we're also going to start up this thing called Mass Illusion to do these 2 film projects that I've got. One of which turned out to be The Matrix. The other was the Robin Williams one with the paint. What Dreams May Come."
Thank you. Yes, something took my tongue.
So I took the call from my old boss at ILM, Scott Ross, who had left the partner, as you know, with Jim Cameron and Stan Winston to start Digital Domain in early '93. So I went out to open.
And a young Doug Roble at the time, I think, was already started
Doug
there.
Roble. Yeah, absolutely.
A very young Doug Roble. He's actually been on this channel. He's one of the first folks I interviewed because he's such a personality, and now he's off making digital humans to fool us.
And then we did a ton of stuff before I think Apollo 13 was spinning up, and then I got asked by Warner Brothers to start their in-house digital division, because this would be the 3rd time I'd done that now. So that was basically my calling card, was starting up a digital division from scratch, and then creatively supervising it and all that. So
you helped consult Sony as well in some of their animation projects as well. That's right. So you kind of did the rounds, helping consult everybody, I think.
That was the time that I consulted in LA after I left founding DD in '93. Between '93 and '96, I had basically, DD had so much work. And I saw an opportunity. I kept working for DD, but I spun out this company of my own called Digital Photography, and subcontracted. So a lot of the work that I did in LA was contracting for Metrolight, DD, Sony. We spun up Anaconda. That was what I went in for animation consulting on that. And again at Warner Brothers, working with John Dykstra came in, so I worked closely with John on Batman Forever, on a whole bunch of stuff. So back with Doug Trumbull in '92, I really spun up the whole concept of pre-visualization in a digital way. So Colin Green, I hired right out of college. He left and ended up spinning up PLF, Pixel Liberation Front, which at the time, if you would remember, was really the first big specialized previs company before the Third Floor existed, and they spun up. So I was all about previs, and also I got into games in a big way. I'm a lifelong hardcore gamer. So did a lot of game work, including Maxis did SimCity 4. And again, they just subcontracted all the content. And I hired, studios all around the world. And so it was a blast. It was a lot of fun. That early mid 90s was really a big heyday, and did that until about '96. And that's when ILM called me back to specifically to do the Star Wars Special Edition trilogy, and I had just worked with Matt and Trey to pitch South Park to Comedy Central in LA. And they said, "Great, you can start it. You can start up the studio to build South Park and build the pipeline and run the whole production." And all that. I said, that farting Canadian, peanut head stuff is cute, but George Lucas just called me to go work on the Star Wars re-releases.
So Spirit of Christmas came out, and then there was also like a pilot for the show, or was it actually effectively the pilot?
Neither actually. So there were actually two Spirit of Christmases that were done as independent, traditional construction paper kind of calling cards. I forget the name of the studio executive, but you can Google it, who did it kind of as a Christmas card, as a gag, right? And then they did a pilot on their own, 22-minute traditional animation stand, took like 9 months, 6 to 9 months to make. And they were getting rebuffed by the studios, including Comedy Central, to say, no, you got to do these things in like 4 days, not 6 months. So they heard of me and they called me and said, "Dude, you're this, computer graphics guy who does things that have never been done before." So yeah, single-handedly. So in a 2-week period, I took a 10-second clip of their traditional pilot. I actually have the background set up right there. So this is see.
Absolutely. Wow. So that's from the original. That's the test from the test you basically did.
Real scale. Yeah. So this is the background setup that I was given with my construction paper cutouts, and that sold Comedy Central because I put them side by side, and I used Alias and I ray traced it and film grain and 3:2 pull down and made it look janky, and so they couldn't tell the difference because they said it can't look like computer graphics. It can't be plastic. It's got to look like construction paper. So yeah, so that sold the show to Comedy Central. This was the summer of '96.
But then you went off to ILM rather than build a studio.
Right, went to ILM. Yeah, exactly.
I always wondered how we got a copy of the Spirit of Christmas in C building at ILM.
Because I brought it there. That's why.
Now I know the source. Wow, that was inspirational. Johanna and I still have somewhere that VHS copy that we got from C building when they made a copy of it. So we do still have that original copy. It's a total tangent, and I'll link to it here. You can go and look at the Spirit of Spawn, which was a take on the Spirit of Christmas, but done at ILM with Spaz and I think Dennis Muren, and of course George Lucas has a cameo, sort of. And I absolutely recommend that you take a moment at the end of this video to go down and click on the link and watch the Spirit of Spawn, which was I think probably just a year or two after that tape was circulated. It was
because Scott knew that I had done South Park, and he said, "So how did you do that?" And so I just told him how I did it, and he did the Spirit of Spawn. And you can see it's Spaz, Christoph, and a bunch of others sitting in the front row, and I'm sitting right behind him. I don't have a beard, and I got my baseball cap, so I'm right behind him.
So here you are at ILM. You're working on Special Edition, which that happened to be the same year I started. Of course, that was the mailroom for me at the time. But I mean that again was the growth period of ILM during 96 to 2000 was where it went from somewhere around 400 or 500 people to 1,200 people, basically. It was about that kind of expansion, which meant that when you left, it was not better or worse, but definitely a different studio now. When I first came in, right, the majority of the buildings weren't CG, and by the time you left, nearly all the buildings were CG, and they were converting stages to artists' workspaces at that point.
As you say, I ended up leaving ILM about 2000 because we started to be a little repetitive, and even then I was kind of jaded. I got assigned to Perfect Storm, and I quit. It's like I was a character guy, I was lighting and shading and camera and cinematography. And another thing that jaded me or displeased me as an artist, as a technical artist, was because of the scale that ILM was getting when I was in the late 90s, like 99. They decided, probably wisely, that they had to try at least more specialization. So the more generalist technical TDs like me, who you would get these beautiful view paint models and matte paintings, And that was it, basically, right? Because you had if they were characters, obviously they'd have a character animator, but if they were spaceships, I'm flying the Millennium, I flew the Millennium Falcon into Cloud City, shading, lighting, obviously comp, any kind of camera work, multi-plane. So you were really and you filed that pixel, the pixel you see in the theater with your parents at the premiere. That's that's got some ownership. So I remember on Small Soldiers, which was a brilliant show, so difficult and a lot of fun. That was the first show where they came to us and said, you're not going to comp your own shot. You're going to be a lighting TD. So you can shade and light it, but you got to render off all the elements and give it to another TD whose only job is to composite your shot. And I say, the hell you are.
Right, the specialization, which became a requirement of a large company doing large effects, I could see that sucking some of the fun away, and we saw that continue to live on. I think a little bit in the Rebel Mac unit, which effectively became a smaller version of what ILM used to be, right? Where like one person would work on a bunch of different elements of the shot, a bunch of different aspects of the shot. Matte painting, and then we build the spaceship all in the same, all in the same computer, same workstation.
Yeah, because there's pros and cons. There's when you have a huge pipeline with 8 people touching a shot, all brilliant, contributing as they are, you just like on the special edition, there's like 8 of us in a room, and George Lucas looks at me and says, can you add a cloud car in this shot between frames 67 and 92 as the camera pans behind the window? And I say, yeah, sure. And he leaves the room, and the Visitor Flex producer says, are you out of your mind? It's going to film out in 3 days. I said, that's fine. I'm just going to break the pipeline, and I'm going to do it all myself. And it's just, you do a quick model, and you projection map the thing in the cloud car, and you animate it, you motion blur, and you comp it, and you light it just right, and you're done. And it takes, a day and a half. But you just can't do that.
Right? It was background.
Yeah, if that had to go to 6 different departments, and be checked out and checked in, and just forget about it.
Yeah, and you got to wait for the renders, right? Render farm requires generally at least a day iteration of each step. So if you've got 6 steps and they're rendering dailies and stuff in between, then you've got minimum of a day a person just to really hand it off to each other. So yeah,
for those previous reasons I was talking about, little jaded, not doing new stuff as much anymore, breaking up into specialties, wasn't happy about that, but also I get called by them, this top secret team within Microsoft, who was saying, what we're trying to do is create a box to pipe content into the living rooms of America, and had this 10-year plan of losing on the hardware, so it turned out to be the Xbox project. So I left specifically to work for Microsoft and Warner Brothers to develop first-party content for the Xbox project, because again, I was really into games and stuff. In 2000, gaming was not the trillion-dollar industry it is today. It was still very much, the term hardcore gamer, on hyped up PCs, or you had your little Nintendo, and that was basically it. So the concept of, what became the PlayStation and the Xbox battle later was not on the horizon. So that was like, you're quitting ILM to work on a video game? Are you out of your mind? So I've done that a lot, and then got out of production eventually to get into teaching, which was later. But
you seem to have 2 phases. There's the idea of giving back through SIGGRAPH, and then giving back through being a teacher. And I think you started working more with SIGGRAPH, which might have, I'm just guessing, might have been a bit of an impetus to kind of work towards that type of teaching role. SIGGRAPH is all about giving back. My wife and I, for 5 years, 6 years now, have been doing talks there and trying to generate generate mostly birds of a feather based kind of conversations. And we hosted a couple this year as well, plug for myself there, on storage, rendering. And then my wife and I do one called Bridging the Gap, which is talking about production and technology, and usually some subjects that are difficult to deal with between the two. But you actually were a chair at some point, so maybe you could give me a little just insight into what your experience is like with SIGGRAPH, and maybe how that, or did that fuel your interest in becoming a teacher at all?
Yeah, you're right. It definitely tied in. And, but yeah, I started attending SIGGRAPH in 1988. It was Atlanta, I think was my first one, and very quickly started volunteering in general. And then I was Computer Animation Festival chair in 2006 in Boston, the CAF, or the ET, Electronic Theater. And then after that, I was asked to be a full conference chair for 2010. And then I rolled off onto longer term, like outstanding service award chair, that kind of stuff. But that tenure ended. I did that for 4 years. But now, so I've ended my official volunteering for this era. I've spent a lot of time since and overlapping with 2 other conferences, which are really close to my heart. The View Conference, which is in Torino, Italy, and that's always in October. And FMX, which is always in the spring, usually first 2 weeks of May in Stuttgart, Germany. Yes. And both of those are A+, top-notch, very specialized, VFX animation, much smaller than SIGGRAPH, but definitely worth absolutely going to those conferences as well. And in addition to going up through the ranks of supervising at ILM and other places, right? CG Soup, Sequence Soup, VFX Soup, producing, the volunteering at SIGGRAPH was great, having large teams and having to deal with. It was all about teaching in the end, and that is what got me interested. And into initially Northeastern University hired me full time to head their animation program, and I started up a 4-year undergrad game design program from scratch, and stayed there for 8 years at Northeastern in Boston. Spun out a startup that was about location-based mobile augmented reality called Building Conversation. It was for architecture, visualization. Did that for 2 years, and ever since then, I've been at the School of Visual Arts in New York City for 5.5 years now. I think I started in 2016. So I'm the chair of the MFA Computer Arts Department. So it's a 2-year MFA, got 100 graduate students. Yeah, there's actually 2 undergraduate animation programs. One is traditional 2D animation, and another is CG VFX. So there's actually 2 separate BFA and departments. Yeah.
Do you ever long to go back to working on a show, going back to one of the big studios, or do you find it sort of I couldn't go back now? How do you feel about it?
My daughters ask me that pretty often. Do you miss it? Because my oldest daughter, especially Chelsea, who's a great artist, she had contributed when she was very young to texture maps on video games, and she did game testing at LucasArts and all that kind of stuff. So she was really in it with Daddy. No, I checked myself pretty quick to know that I would get eaten alive by the young, smart kids today. And I'll live off of the memories back, again, through the late 80s, through early mid 90s, were really something special. It was really amazing. It's a whole different ball game these days. When I look at the amount of data that's being handled, I think the first one that just made me shake my head was when the Transformers movies came out, and you just saw this, bazillion triangles on screen. But I've really been attracted by real time for 20 years. So if you're attracted to real time, then your renaissance or your next renaissance is now upon us. I mean, GPU in real time right now is just in the last 2 years, or even the last year. I mean, it's just, we're on that part of the curve now where, in fact, even render farming, birds of feather, I was talking to somebody in NVIDIA about making sure they come, because NVIDIA GPU farming is now a thing. So you have so many GPU jobs now. I expected this was going to happen. It was real time, and then all of a sudden everybody submitted a bunch of frames, and now it's queued up again. But needless to say, the idea of GPU in real time, whether it's changed. It's changed the game, except for the fact that, again, I pointed this out, is artists. I pointed this out in a half dozen of my videos. The
gas fills the container. Artists will consume the resource they're given to make something even cooler. So if you can now make it look just as cool as you did with a GPU as you could with a CPU, well, then they'll go, well, if I put it to 8 hours of rendering, think about how much cooler the GPU render will now look. And next thing you know, they've got an 8-hour frame. I posit that the 8-hour frame will forever be the unit of measurement that an artist thinks about as realistic and still.
Don't tell anybody. Don't listen to them. 8 hours. You're out of your mind. You're out of your 8 hours. No. I was gonna say, 1 hour frame, because I tell my students, like 30 years ago, 25 years ago, 20 years ago, if you tried to normalize to a 1 hour a frame render, which was pretty generous back then, and it looked like it looked back then, but today, if you've got a 1 hour a frame render, so that in 8 hours, forget 8 hours. That's crazy.
Well, here's what you're focused on. What you're saying, Terrence, and this is the problem with the 8-hour frame. Why it happens is because artists will think in their mind, I can submit and look at it tomorrow morning, and that's overnight, and that's an 8-hour window.
Yeah, it's an overnight. An over hour.
What they're not thinking about is it's really 100 frames or 50 frames, and if one of those frames recues or gets delayed or has a glitch, you're now not going to see your work in the morning, or you're going to have to in between some frames or something. And so as soon as you get into the really greater than 4 or 5 hour, you should assume that you're probably actually not going to see your render tomorrow morning. And that's a bigger problem now than you had before. And so that's where your point and my point both come and point at each other, right? Yes, you absolutely do not want to go over 1 or 2 hour frames in general in your workflow. And I'd say very many average frames are 1 to 2 hours. But when you get into 4 to 8 hours, you start, basically starving yourself the next day. And I have seen too many times the 24-hour frames and such, and it literally can take a week to render that, and that freaks everybody out. They're thinking, okay, a day, we'll get a day. It's like, no, 1 of those 2 frames is not going to happen, and it's gonna and then you're going to realize you actually need to change something, and now you're resubmitting, so it's a week later that you're looking at that shot. And those are often the last shots they're working on in a show, right? And so
and back then I just got disgusted, because when you get to be a high-level supervisor or a producer on a show, and you have a script and you board it, you realize there's just no reason or excuse for that kind of overkill in render times, because it's just sloppy, right? You're being wooed by, like you say, well, if I hit the button at 7 p.m., it's going to be ready at 7 a.m. But you don't know how many gazillions of proc hours it's taking, because you can just be sloppy, frankly. You can have, and this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, when I was sequence supervisor on the swamp sequence in Phantom Menace, episode 1, that started with the landing ships coming down to Naboo, and Jar Jar, running through and being introduced, and all the way up to the underwater city thing. And I got models that were unrenderable. They were so data heavy, because they would hire an industrial designer who'd never worked on a film before, and they would model, with alias design. They would model the threads on every screw in every L bracket, in every frame, and every, in these like landing ships. And it would be painful even just to get it loaded in memory, so that then you could strip away 90% of it that was never seen. I was never the smartest guy anywhere, much less ILM, as like a simulation TD or R&D TD, but what I was really good at is looking at a sequence of storyboards and saying, okay, I know how to do this to the highest level, but super optimized, so we could get it done in days, not months.
Yeah, the idea of it's the thing I've talked about a bit, even in some of our talks, is idea of maximizing the resource, using the resource to its full maximum potential, or creating the minimum viable product to get it onto the screen. I mean, something that if you work for George Lucas's movies, you'll learn very quickly that it doesn't need to look perfect. It just needs to look good enough. And that is it really it stabs a lot of artists in the heart when they hear it sometimes, that like it just needs to look good enough, because an artist wants to make the best work they can. I find this is a common thread. This is why hire the best artists. They're going to want to do the best work they can, and you're hiring the best artists to do just good enough work sometimes. And I mean good enough meaning it's good enough so that the viewer enjoys it and the box office receipts come in, and that it could look better, sure, but no one's going to make any more money, and the viewer is not going to be more entertained by the granularity of the
exactly right.
And
that's the trick right there. Is the viewer's never going to know. The viewer's never going to know. The other thing that everyone should know about those early 90s was, especially when original DD spun up 93, 94, is they had a real chip on the shoulder. We did with the pirate flag flying, and rightly so. But it was the height of the golden age of Cinefex Magazine, right? So if you as an artist had a shot that was in an issue of Cinefex, that was amazing. But the downside was if you were the VFX supervisor of a show that was highlighted in Cinefex and you knew about it, well, you will pixel those shots.
Cinefex requires 8K renders for those images. That's what at least they did at the end there. So you had to actually generate an 8K single frame. Yeah. So you can imagine, you better pixel like that a lot, because it's going to be so high res.
Again, I was very blessed to have come up under the wing of analog VFX supervisors like Joel Hynek, like Dennis Muren. Down and dirty, looks great. Next sequence, and that really kind of held with that old school.
So a lot of that I find stems from also that original model shop stage mentality. I mean, people don't realize that when they look at the Mos Eisley in the special edition, that they're looking at a whole lot of styrofoam paper cups stacked on top of each other and glued together.
Colored Q-tips in the stand.
And Q-tips, and Q-tips for the crowd and the pod racing. That's all it takes. And so you could render each face. Why would you ever do that? It is important that people think about the minimum in software. They'll call it the minimum viable product, right? The minimum it takes to get a useful a use of it out there, and don't spend a minute more on it. And it means that it's not going to be perfect, but your art is for home, and then your craft is for work. And the craft is whatever the clipboard says you need to do.
Well, and for the people listening, this is not about doing a half-assed job. This is not at all about cheating or not doing AAA quality stuff, because this, it's ILM we're talking about, and it's a matter of, having our brain fill in the details. Is something about, it's only showing the monster in the shadows. It's not, that's another thing. You can do the whole retrospective of how modern CG horror films and all that, of just everything's in brightly lit, because the producer says, wait a minute, we spent $1 million on this sequence, we're going to see the monster. Well, you don't. It's like, let's go to Jaws, let's go to Alien, and if you Google up the classic oil painting on glass matte painting techniques, which I was so grateful to watch up close, Yusei Wesky and all these guys on Hook, that it's very loose. If you look up, Matte World Digital, Craig Barron's history on matte painting, it's very wide brushes, and you zoom in, it's not an 8K render. It's really, because your eye fills in the details, and it actually makes it more rich by doing that. And yes, it's a lot faster and cheaper to do it that way, but it's also better.
So anytime you can reduce that labor cost, you've done the show a favor, you've done your reputation a favor, and doing it and still putting out a good product that's really the hard part. I think Fawn Davis said in a previous video,
there's a difference between an amateur and a professional model maker.
There you go.
Professional model maker takes pride in how little time they spend on something, and the amateur model maker takes pride in how long they spend on something. So it'll be like, I spent a year making this ship perfect, and we're like, I did it in a day.
Exactly. That was the important part. That was the skill, was able to build it in 2 days, not spend 2 months building it. And that's the craft, right? That's where it becomes taking your art and turning it into a craft, which is where you can actually make money and a project that is defined that wasn't yours. The other thing, right, that I guess your students probably come to the realization at some point in their journey is you're not making your art, you're making someone else's art. You might think it absolutely should look more smooth or purple, or it doesn't matter if the director
You do have to
wants
rip
green.
it out of their hands. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my students are making their art, but it might be the last time that they get to do that before they go start working for somebody else. And so I try to instill them to say, okay, let's spend a lot of time on the boards and try to, lock down and edit so that this asset is only seen from this direction, and it's only a mid-ground object, and it's in one shot for 3 seconds. So let's put that in context of your production spreadsheet and allocate, an appropriate amount of time and effort on that. Now, if it's a money shot, if it's your key spaceship, if it's the Millennium Falcon, you bet your ass you're gonna, spend 360 degrees on that model, and it's gonna, hold up on close-ups as well as far away shots. But that kind of intelligent breakdown is what the good supervisors do, looking at boards or breaking down scripts, and why, John Knoll was so brilliant back in the day about not sitting on existing tools and say, well, we just got to force it through this existing methodology. No. Just complete free reign of coming up with crazy solutions and analog stuff and Rebel Mac. And
have you found that from when you started to now, like what you're teaching students or how you're teaching students, has it changed because of changes in the industry greatly, or do you find yourself still focusing on like the 10 fundamentals or something? How do you see the
no, that's a great question. My initial response would be, no, I'm not teaching them differently at all, except in the final months of their second year. So it's a 2-year MFA. How to get prepared to get a job and work in the industry is definitely different. And in the end, I think it's a positive thing, because the additional remote work alone creates more job opportunities, especially I'm like 75% in international students.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't necessarily have to, deal with visa issues and immigration and have to physically move and live, in London to work for those shows. But no, I've got, 50 new students every fall. And I start off with the same question, which is, why are you here? And what story do you want to tell? And let's have that journey together. So that's ultimately my job as the department chair, is hire the best teaching faculty. We're all adjuncts, which is brilliant. So we had, tons of people, production artists and technical artists from Blue Sky teaching, because we're in Manhattan, right? It was really close by, and all the studios locally in New York. And you just draw that idea, that spark, that passion out of their brain, get them to describe it, put it down, and refine that until it ultimately becomes their thesis. And it's mostly, pre-rendered rectangles. It's mostly short animated films. But we've got, I think we're on our 9th or 10th Student Academy Award winner now. So it's at a very high level. In addition to the really super cool, wacky experimental art students, about 10%, who do real-time projection mapped haptic surface, VR sound. Again, on day one in, September 1st, I drive my staff and my faculty crazy, because yes, we have 2D courses and a track, motion graphics and 2D animation. We've got 3D and Houdini effect stuff, and we've got this, but forget all that, do anything you want, mix it all up, just show us something that the world has never seen before. And I mean it. And we try to facilitate that, to say, do a cloud tank in a wading pool with a high-speed camera and splash it with, blue gloves, and then digitize that, and, forget it, go to Houdini first. Let's see what, just shoot live action stuff and combine it. And I try to do that, have them really think out of the box.
Yeah,
Old
having
school,
been
the way we used to do it.
I've always been in charge of for a lot of years, been in charge of the IO teams alongside the rendering teams. And I've always been kind of taken delight seeing the oddball request from an artist who brings in that thumb drive because they went out and like shot some element with their phone or their camera because they want to bring it in because they realize like they're doing it in the program's one thing, but it's just so great to see that like the old way of doing things. Like I said, going back to Star Wars, like, did you know those were just styrofoam cups? Like you didn't have to go kit bash or create vacuum forms. They just painted some Dixie cups and went, boop. I can't go back to the industry. It doesn't matter which studio. I too am like, I don't think I could go back, but I am blessed that I get to be a part of it every day. So that's the best of both worlds. And I think that's the take home of this particular life VFX, right? Is you stay immersed in the part that really invigorates you and really excites you. And you don't have to do shot work for 50 hours a week. You can still get there. Now, maybe in the beginning, you still got to put in some time, but there are many avenues that are still related to this industry. I work with multiple people who are formerly in the industry who now work on the vendor side. I know multiple people who are teachers, folks who just, gone off to start their own company. So they're in VFX, but they're company owners now. And so they're not really, it's the same as being an artist, right? There's so many avenues to stay in the industry, but not be in the day-to-day lifestyle of an artist. So
that'd be a great takeaway if that's a good overview of this podcast episode. Is just what you said, and definitely what I try to tell my students about before they get out the door, to say, take any job you're offered initially. Don't be a snob and turn down something to say that's not exactly what I had in mind. Take that job. You have no idea. You don't know what you don't know is one of my favorite phrases. You have no idea what you don't know. And to get into some place, to have these happy accidents of the people that you meet, of the fascinating stuff that you find out about, you have no idea how incredibly rich and broad this industry is that's, roughly described as VFX. And if you're fortunate enough to have a certain specialty that you're really super passionate about, hold on to that for sure, right? And make that known to the world so that you can gravitate into that at your earliest opportunity.
Right. And they should keep working on their own work too. Like you said, like a lot of your students are often working on their own work, and it'll be the last they do before they're working on others. But number one, it takes years. And I've had a few of my interviewees telling me about this. It takes years to get that work onto your reel. So by the time you show it on your reel, it's 2 and 3 years old. And so you always want to be working on some of your own stuff so that you have relevant new material on your reel that's your own. Even if it's short, that's fine. That's an important part of it, is don't just rely on the studio experience in the first couple of years to get your reel up, because it's going to take often years to get from the time you're working on it to the time it's actually in front of some other prospective employer. It's like a 3-year window sometimes. It's sad but true. Or
I know that the worst case scenario, and I know of several stories of my coworkers at ILM where they would work for 3 or 6 months on a sequence of shots, and the director in editing would say, "Nah, it doesn't really work for me." Cut it on the edit room floor. Not only can you not put that on your reel, you can't even get the footage, because in this case, like, ILM is contractually obligated not to let that footage out of the studio.
And there are projects that people in perpetuity cannot talk about that they worked on, that they exist out there. They're not as common, but I certainly know of projects, which I won't mention, that cannot be discussed in perpetuity. You're simply contractually say you never worked on it. That's it. And so how are you going to put that on your reel, right? So always keep working on your personal stuff is a lot. I've heard a handful of artists on my channel here say that. Always keep putting stuff on your reel that is your work, and you can always never been most relevant work with the relevant tools. That's not the stuff that's 4 and 5 years old, which is what your reel starts happening over time, is it ends up being behind the times. And with technology changing, 5 years ago, things didn't look the way the most recent version did. So
it's just so easy. I mean, that's the only reason I'm on social media, is because my students are, and I want to promote their work. And at the same time, I'm exposed to these brilliant independent artists doing their own work on Instagram and Twitter. And I'll follow them, or I'll find people that might end up teaching for me, or guest lecturing, or I'm just a fanboy, and I'll just follow them. So it's this rich ocean of undiscovered, brilliant, independent work out there on these social media platforms.
I want to thank you for making time today, Terrence, for this call. It's really, really informative. I can't wait to see what the final edit looks like because we covered a lot of topics, and I'm really glad about that. I know you're going to be at SIGGRAPH this year, like we mentioned. So, I'll definitely meet up, and I'll be hosting a handful of talks. So I'll make sure to let you know where they're at. I know that we're going to be doing a couple of events. We'll be doing a party with a vendor. So I'll make sure to let you know where that's happening. It'll be downtown.
Yeah, please do.
So you can drop in, and we'll make sure to cross paths when you're there. I really appreciate all the information you've given me. I learned a lot on this call. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're a real kid. Yeah, you're a very specialized kindred spirit. Because, like I said, in my early days, I loved being a render wrangler. I have incredible respect for the back of the house people, of which I was one in the early days. So it's kudos, man. I'm glad you're doing it.
Those people.
Absolutely. Cool. Thanks, Joe. That was awesome.
Yeah.